My name is Lorraine Matthews. I am 74 years old now, but there are nights when I close my eyes and I am still that girl, young, trembling, lying on the hardwood floor of my father's house with a smell of sweat, dust, and fear thick in my throat. People imagine betrayal as whispers behind your back or friends who abandon you in hard times. They don't understand what betrayal really is. Betrayal is when the people who are meant to protect you become the ones who pin you down. I remember the sound before anything else. Heavy boots on the floorboards, the creak of the hallway door. My father's voice, calm but sharp as a blade. "Stay still, Lorraine." The command sank into my bones like ice. Froze. Then I felt his hand, iron on my shoulder, pressing me down into the floor. The weight of it was worse than any blow. It wasn't just flesh and muscle. It was authority. It was the crushing weight of a lifetime of his rules, his temper, his control. I wanted to scream. I wanted to claw my way free. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came. My voice had been trained out of me long before that night. Years of don't talk back, years of keep quiet, years of knowing that in our house his word was law. Through the haze of terror I saw them. My brothers. Mark, David, Stephen. Boys I had grown up with, played tag with in the fields, shared secrets with in the dark. Their faces weren't the faces I knew. Their eyes had a glint I had never seen before. Cruel, eager, wrong. The moment I realized they were standing with him and not with me, something inside me cracked. I begged with my eyes, but they looked through me. I wanted one of them, just one, to remember I was their sister. But the silence stretched, and my father's grip held, and I understood. I was no longer their blood. I was prey. The room shrank around me. I heard the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, mocking me with its steady rhythm. I smelled the damp wood, the faint trace of kerosene from the lamp on the table. My heart thundered so loud I thought it might burst from my chest. And then came the laughter. Low, ugly, shared between them like a secret. That was the moment the betrayal carved itself into me. Not just because of what they were about to do, but because of what it meant. My father, the man who should have shielded me, held me down instead. My brothers, who should have stood beside me, circled like vultures. The details blur when I try to force them back. Trauma has a way of smudging the edges. What remains is the weight. The fear. The shame. The sound of my father's voice telling me to stop squirming. The sound of my brothers whispering things I'll never repeat. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. When it was over, I lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling beams, my body trembling, my mind screaming in a silence so loud it deafened me. And then my father leaned down, his breath hot on my ear. "You'll say nothing, Lorraine. Do you hear me?" "Nothing." I nodded because nodding was the only thing left I could do. He stood, adjusted his belt, and walked out as if nothing had happened. My brothers followed, not one of them looking back. The door closed. The room was dark again. I curled into myself, pulling my knees to my chest, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be completely alone. The house felt different after that night. Every creak in the floor, every shadow in the hallways, every look from my father carried a new, suffocating weight. My brothers laughed louder at meals, their jokes sharper, their glances colder. And I sat there silent, shrinking smaller and smaller, convinced no one would ever believe me if I spoke. 'Cause who would? My father was respected in town. My brothers were the golden boys. Athletes, charming, liked by neighbors. And me. I was the quiet girl in the corner, too timid, too obedient. That night stole more than my innocence. Stole my trust. Stole my voice. But it did not kill my memory. Even as I lay in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling with tears drying on my cheeks, I made myself a promise. One day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for years, but one day I would make the world see them for what they truly were. I didn't know then how. I didn't know when. All I knew was this. Silence may have been forced on me, but it would not keep me forever. And when I broke it, I would break it loud enough for everyone to hear. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. When people hear my story, they always ask the same question. Didn't you see it coming? The truth is, I didn't. Or maybe I did, in small ways, in moments I didn't understand until much later. Maybe the warning signs were there, painted into the fabric of my childhood, but I was too young, too trusting, too desperate for love to see them for what they were. My earliest memories of my father are of a man who towered over everyone. Daniel Matthews was tall, broad-shouldered. His voice deep enough to shake the walls when he was angry. And he was often angry. He believed in rules, and he believed in fear. He believed children were to be seen and not heard. He believed obedience was love, and silence was respect. I remember sitting at the dinner table, hands folded tightly in my lap, stomach growling, while he said grace for what felt like hours. If one of us shifted in our seat or whispered to the other, his eyes snapped up, sharp as whips. Sit still. Show respect. We learned quickly. Respect meant silence. Respect meant swallowing words, even when they burned our tongues. My mother died when I was 6. After that, the house was his alone. He ruled it like a kingdom, and we were subjects, not children. Mark, the eldest of my 3 brothers, learned fastest how to curry his favor. He mimicked father's mannerisms, puffing out his chest, deepening his voice even as a boy. David was the charmer, always quick with a smile, the one who smoothed things over when father's temper flared. And Stephen, the youngest, followed the others like a shadow, eager to belong. And me. I was the odd one out. I loved books, flowers, singing softly to myself when I thought no one listened. I tried to be gentle in a house that valued hardness. I tried to be kind in a place where kindness was mistaken for weakness. Lorraine, father would say, his voice dripping with disdain. You'll never survive in this world with that softness. Toughen up, or you'll be eaten alive. I never understood he was warning me about himself. At first, the cracks were subtle. I remember being 8 years old playing in the yard when Mark shoved me into the dirt. My dress tore at the knee, my palms stung from gravel. I looked up at him, expecting father to scold him. But instead father chuckled. That's how you make her tough, he said. The others laughed with him. And I learned then that in our house, cruelty was not punished. It was rewarded. By the time I was a teenager, the dynamic was carved in stone. My brothers mocked me at meals, flicked peas at my hair, pulled my braids, made crude jokes about my place as the only girl. If I cried, father shook his head. Pathetic, he muttered. Stop acting like a child. And when I tried to fight back, to raise my voice, the punishment was swift. Do not talk back to me, Lorraine, he snapped. You don't get a voice in this house. So I learned to bury mine. But inside I hated them for it. There were moments, small, fleeting, where I thought maybe things could have been different. Like when David once handed me a piece of cake at a cousin's birthday and said softly, "Here, I saved you the last one." Or when Stephen at 12 sat beside me after school and said, "Don't cry, Lorraine. Father just doesn't understand you." Those moments kept me holding on, kept me believing they were still my brothers, still capable of love. But kindness in our house was never free. It always had strings. It was always swallowed up by the next act of cruelty. The older we grew, the worse it became. By 16, I was the housekeeper more than the sister. Cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, running errands while they played sports, went to parties, lived their lives. Father praised them for their accomplishments. He ignored mine as if survival was not an accomplishment. The worst part wasn't the chores. It was the way they looked at me sometimes. Not as a sister, not as a person, but as something else. Something lesser. Something they owned. I would catch Mark's eyes lingering too long. His smirk curling in ways that made my stomach turn. David's jokes became sharper, hinting at things I didn't have the words for then. Stephen, the youngest, followed suit, laughing along with them, his eyes darting to Father for approval. And Father, God, Father, he never stopped them. He laughed when they laughed. He looked away when they pushed too far. He taught them with his silence that my pain was entertainment, that my discomfort was deserved. Looking back now, I see it clearly. They were grooming each other, feeding off his approval, learning that power came from making me small. I wanted to tell someone, teacher, a neighbor, anyone. But who would have believed me? Daniel Matthews was respected in town, known as a man who ran a tight ship. My brothers were the golden boys, athletes and achievers. And me? I was the quiet one, the girl who lowered her eyes, the girl who kept to herself. They had written my story for me long before I knew I could write my own. The night it all changed, the night that still echoes in my bones, wasn't born out of nowhere. It was the final eruption of years of small humiliations, years of warning signs I didn't recognize until it was too late. I see now that it was always heading there. Every laugh at my expense. Every time Father told them, "That's how you make her tough." Every time I swallowed words that should have been screams. It was a pattern, woven into the fabric of our family. A pattern of silence, of cruelty, of betrayal disguised as discipline. And when it finally broke, when the betrayal came in its full and terrible form, I realized something that nearly destroyed me. I had been alone all along. Not one of them had ever truly been my brother. Not one of them had ever truly been my father. And that knowledge, that unbearable knowledge, was the crack that split me open. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. The night it all came crashing down is one I carry in my bones like an old scar. I can talk about it now, but when I do, I don't tell the story in order. I tell it in fragments. 'Cause that's how it lives in me. A patchwork of fear, shame, and silence stitched together with a thread of betrayal. I remember the air first. Thick, heavy, summer air pressing against the windows. The kind of night where you feel the heat in your lungs with every breath. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep, when the door creaked open. First I thought it was the wind. But then I saw the shadow. "Get up," my father's voice ordered. My stomach dropped. There was no arguing with him. Not then. Not ever. He grabbed my arm, his fingers bruising even in that first touch. He dragged me into the hallway, and there they were. My brothers. Waiting. Faces I had known all my life. Now twisted, unfamiliar, terrifying. "What's happening?" I whispered, my voice small, weak. No one answered. Father pushed me into the living room, the old floorboards groaning under our feet. The clock ticked in the corner, steady, uncaring, marking the moment like a witness that would never testify. I begged with my eyes. I begged in silence. "Please," I thought. "Please don't. Please remember I'm your daughter. Please remember I'm your sister." But their eyes held nothing of family, nothing of love. When Father's hand forced me down, when his voice hissed, "Stay still," the last thread of trust I'd ever held snapped clean in two. The rest comes in flashes. The sound of laughter, low and cruel. The burn of tears I couldn't stop. The suffocating weight of hands holding me where I didn't want to be. The ceiling beams above me, blurred by salt water, as though the house itself refused to look. I tried to scream, but the sound lodged in my throat like a stone. All I managed was a ragged gasp that no one in that room cared to hear. Time warp. Seconds stretched into hours. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might tear through my chest. My whole body shook, but the more I struggled, the more my father's grip dug into me. His strength wasn't just physical. It was the power of years of control, years of silencing me until my own voice had forgotten itself. And my brothers. God, my brothers, they followed his lead like disciples. Smirks on their lips, cruelty in their eyes. When it ended, they left one by one, footsteps receding into the hall like nothing had happened. Father was the last to go. He leaned close, his breath foul against my ear. "You'll say nothing, Lorraine," he said. "Do you hear me? Nothing." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. I curled into myself on the cold floor, shaking so hard my teeth clattered. My dress was torn at the shoulder, my hair damp with sweat and tears. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to hold myself together as though I might disappear if I didn't. The silence pressed against me until it roared. I wanted to die. Truly, in that moment I wanted it all to end. Because if this was what family was, if this was what love had been reduced to, then what was left for me? I lay there for hours, staring at nothing, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter drifting down the hall. My body shook, my mind fractured, my soul hollowed. When the sun rose, it felt wrong. How could the world dare to be bright when I was broken? At breakfast the next morning, they all sat around the table as though nothing had happened. Father sipped his coffee. Mark buttered toast. David and Stephen joked about baseball scores. I sat there in silence, my spoon clinking against my bowl, my hands trembling too much to hold it steady. And then Mark looked at me. Just a glance. And he smirked. I dropped my spoon. The clatter was deafening. Father's eyes snapped to mine. "Pick it up, Lorraine," he said, calm but firm. I bent to the floor, my hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries. My brothers chuckled softly. Their laughter meant for me alone. When I straightened, my face burning, I realized something chilling. This was not an accident. This was not a one-time cruelty. This was who they were now. This was who they had always been, waiting for their moment. And in that moment I knew I had no one. No ally. No safety. No family. It was the lowest point of my life, not just because of what they did to me but because of what it meant. I was utterly alone and they knew it. But as I sat there, staring at my bowl of milk gone warm, a single thought rose like smoke through the wreckage of my mind. Not forever. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew one day I would make them pay. The silence they forced on me would one day become the loudest weapon I had. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? 4 years after that night, I carried silence like a second skin. I grew up, I grew older, I left the house when I finally could, but the weight of what had been done to me followed everywhere. It lived in my shoulders, in the way I hunched, in the way I avoided eye contact. It lived in the cracks of my voice whenever I tried to speak too loudly. People saw me as quiet, timid, the girl who never married. They never saw the storm beneath the stillness. For decades I told no one. Who would have believed me? My father had been respected in town until the day he died. My brothers inherited his charm. They had families, jobs, reputations. On the outside they were pillars of the community. On the inside they were wrought in human skin. But silence, I learned, is not the same as surrender. Every time I saw them, at funerals, weddings, family reunions, their eyes searched me, looking for weakness. I gave them nothing. I smiled politely, said as little as possible, and went home with my fists clenched. They thought they had silenced me for life. They were wrong. The turning point came on my 4th birthday. I had lived with the weight for so long I thought it would bury me before I ever spoke of it. But that year something changed. A young woman from town, a neighbor's daughter, came forward with a story about being hurt by someone she trusted. She spoke out. People doubted her. People whispered. But she stood firm. And watching her, something inside me cracked open. If she had the courage to speak, why couldn't I? That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the blue spiral notebook I used for grocery lists. And for the first time in my life I began to write. I wrote about the night it happened. I wrote about my father's hand on my shoulder, the laughter of my brothers, the silence at breakfast. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the ink smeared with tears, until the words filled page after page. It wasn't evidence yet, but it was a record. My record. Proof that I had not imagined it. Proof that my silence had not erased the truth. From that night on, I became a collector. I collected memories, dates, fragments of conversations. Every time one of my brothers slipped and said something cruel at a family gathering, I wrote it down. Every time a cousin muttered about how the Matthews boys were a little too wild, I noted it. Every time I caught someone looking at me with pity in their eyes but refusing to speak, I remembered their faces. I began to track patterns, their tempers, their drinking, their words. And slowly, a case began to take shape. I also started asking quiet questions. To neighbors, to old friends of the family. Subtle things like, did you ever notice how father treated me differently? Or, did you ever feel unsafe around my brothers? Some people shrugged me off. Others gave me looks that said more than words. One old neighbor, Mrs. Collins, squeezed my hand once and whispered, I always wondered what went on in that house. That was enough to keep me going. Still, I knew memory and whispers would not be enough. If I was going to finally expose them, I needed the weight of law behind me. So I researched, late nights on my computer, scrolling through articles about survivors who came forward decades later. Cases built on testimony, on consistency, on courage. I read about statutes of limitations, about exceptions, about how sometimes the truth could still find its way into a courtroom, even after years of silence. It was daunting. It was terrifying. But it was possible. And then came the day I bumped into a retired police officer at the grocery store. Officer Grant. He had known my family when I was a girl. He was older now, his hair white, but his eyes kind. We spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather, the rising cost of milk. Then, before I could stop myself, I asked, do you remember my father? His eyes darkened. Hard man, he said quietly. Kept a tight house. The way he said it, heavy, deliberate, told me he had seen more than he let on. Something in me shifted. If even he had doubts about the man others called respectable, maybe my truth would not fall on deaf ears. 4 months after that I prepared. I gathered every page of my notebooks, every memory written in black ink. I practiced speaking my story out loud, though my voice shook each time. I imagined the questions I might be asked, why I stayed silent, why I waited so long, and I wrote down the answers until they felt like armor instead of excuses. I rehearsed the moment I would walk into the police station. Not as the frightened girl pinned to the floor. Not as the broken woman at the breakfast table. But as the survivor who had carried silence long enough. I told myself I would not waver. I told myself that when the time came, I would not let shame speak louder than truth. But still fear lingered. What if they didn't believe me? What if they laughed like my brothers had laughed? What if I shattered all over again in front of strangers? One night, I sat awake until dawn, staring at the framed photograph of my mother. The only gentle memory in a house that had been anything but. I can't do this, I whispered. And then in the silence that followed, I heard her voice in my mind, clear as day. Yes, you can. I stood, walked to the kitchen, gathered every notebook, every page of my truth, and placed them in a box. I set the box by the door. It was time. Time to break the silence. Time to let the world know what they had done. Time to drag my father and my brothers into the light they had always feared. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. The morning I carried the box to the police station, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that feels like the world holding its breath. My hands shook as I locked the door behind me, the weight of decades heavy in my arms. Inside the box were my notebooks, my written testimony, names, dates, and every memory I had forced onto paper so that no one could ever again tell me it didn't happen. For a moment I froze on the porch. My legs felt like stone. What if they laugh? Thought. What if they send me home? What if I break all over again? Then I heard Father's voice echo in my head. His command from that night. You'll say nothing, Lorraine. And just like that, fear turned into fire. No more, I whispered. I carried the box to my car and drove into town. The police station was a squat brick building I had passed 1,000 times in my life but never dared to enter. Walking through those glass doors felt like stepping into another world. A young officer at the desk looked up. "Can I help you, ma'am?" My throat was dry, but my voice came steady. "Yes," I said. "My name is Lorraine Matthews. I need to report crimes committed against me. By my father and my brothers." His pen froze. His eyes widened. But he didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss me. He stood, called for a detective, and before I knew it, I was sitting in a small room with pale walls and a recording device on the table. Detective Harris, a woman with kind but steady eyes, sat across from me. "Take your time, Lorraine," she said. "We're here to listen." And for the first time in my life I spoke the truth out loud. The words tumbled out in waves, halting at first, then rushing, unstoppable. I told her about my father's hand pressing me down, about the laughter of my brothers, about the silence at breakfast the next morning. My voice cracked, my hands shook, but I kept going. Page after page, memory after memory, until the dam inside me finally broke and everything I had carried poured out into that room. Detective Harris didn't interrupt. She didn't doubt. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply listened, her pen moving swiftly, her gaze steady on mine. When I finished, I felt emptied, hollow, as though I had carved the rot from my chest. "Lorraine," she said softly, "I believe you." Tears filled my eyes. No one had ever said those words to me before. The weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, paperwork, and questions. The detective spoke to old neighbors, family members, people who had seen the cracks in our household but had never pieced them together. Slowly, the truth began to spread. My brothers were questioned. First, they denied everything. Course they did. But denial can't erase decades of patterns, whispers, and the consistency of a survivor's voice. They grew angry, defensive. And then, one by one, they slipped, contradicting themselves, exposing the cracks in their lies. The day the police came to arrest them, word traveled fast. Neighbors watched from porches as Mark, David, and Stephen were led out in handcuffs. Their wives wept. Their children stared wide-eyed, confusion written on their faces. The men who had once strutted through town as golden boys now hung their heads in shame. And me. I stood across the street, my hands clenched at my sides, my heart pounding. For years I had imagined this moment. I thought I would feel nothing but triumph. Instead I felt something deeper, release. For the first time since I was a girl, the weight began to lift. But it wasn't over yet. The trial came months later. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, even people who had once admired my father's tight ship, filled the benches. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the charges were read. I sat at the front, my hands folded in my lap, the box of notebooks by my side. When the prosecutor called my name, I rose and walked to the witness stand. My legs trembled, but my voice was clear. I told my story again, this time to the world. I described the silence of our house, the cruelty disguised as discipline, the night my father betrayed me in the worst way. I told them how my brothers had laughed, how they had sat at breakfast the next morning as though nothing had happened. The courtroom was silent except for my voice. When I finished, I looked at the judge, then at the jury, then finally at my brothers. Their faces were pale, their arrogance gone. For once they had no power. The prosecutor held up my notebooks, the pages filled with my handwriting. "This," she said, "is the record of a survivor who refused to be silenced any longer. This is Lorraine Matthews's truth." The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty. The gavel fell. My brothers' fates were sealed. In that moment I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I simply breathed. A deep, full breath that filled my lungs in a way it never had before. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward me. Lorraine. Lorraine. Do you have anything to say? I stopped, turned to the cameras, and spoke the words I had carried for decades. They told me to stay silent. They told me no one would believe me. But I found my voice. And if you are out there, if you are listening, know this. Your silence is not weakness. And when you speak, the world will have to hear you. The crowd erupted in murmurs, cameras flashing. But I didn't linger. I walked away, head high, the sun breaking through the clouds above me. My father was already gone, buried years earlier with a reputation he did not deserve. But his legacy lay shattered, stripped bare for what it truly was. My brothers would spend their lives paying for the pain they had caused. And me. I was free. Not healed, healing takes a lifetime. But free. I went home, placed my notebooks back on the shelf, and sat in the quiet of my kitchen. For once, the silence didn't feel heavy. Felt like mine. 'Cause I had taken it back. Because I had kept my promise to that broken girl on the floor so many years ago. One day, I'll make them pay. And I had. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Share these stories so no survivor ever feels alone in their silence again.